We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast's discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hello everyone and welcome to Archaeoanimals, the podcast all about zooarchaeology, the relation between humans and animals in past civilizations. With you, as always, Simona Falanga, and my co-host,
Alex Fitzpatrick.
And today we thought we'd spice it up a little, pun very much intended, as we'll be discussing culinary zooarchaeology. So the zooarchaeology.
We're not even a minute in.
Well, as per that previous episode, any complaints, just send an email over to Tristan, #make it stop. But yeah, we'll be talking about food and food preparation in the archaeological record. But I guess the first and foremost, because the most important question here is, Alex, have you eaten?
God, no. Never. Absolutely not. This is going to be complete torture to me. I might die in the middle of this recording.
Don't die in the middle of this recording. It'll be a load of paperwork.
It would, but it would be very apt, I feel like.
Yes.
It's kind of funny because talking about food is so inherent to the topic of zooarchaeology because, you know, zooarchaeology is the study of animals in human history for the most part. So a lot of the ways we use animals is through our consumption of food and resources and things like that. So in a way, we've kind of already covered this for the most part.
Largely, I'd say so.
But I think it's good to have like a dedicated episode to kind of like draw all those like threads of conversation that we've had in previous episodes into like one thing.
Yeah, because I think when you're discussing the zooarchaeology of food, of course, you're looking at different processes which would have happened and indeed still happen in all societies. You have, of course, your animal products that are derived from the exploitation of domesticated species. You have your hunting, food preparation, and the traces that leaves in the archaeological record. You have your feasting, of ritual or otherwise, and most importantly, well, not necessarily most importantly, but definitely most common, the rubbish that is left behind.
It's our favorite thing. We're all trash pandas. That's the saying goes.
Well, for all intents and purposes, as archaeologists, we kind of are, because I think for 99% of the archaeological record is just rummaging through the rubbish of dead people.
Yeah, it makes sense too. When it comes to like deposits of things, you're most likely going to be getting the stuff that people kind of threw away into a hole or behind their house, or in some cases in Scotland, underneath their house. So, yeah, that's kind of just it, isn't it?
Yeah. If they were a little bit less tidy, maybe they would have just chucked it on the side, and then erosional processes have brought them into your ditch.
Those beautiful erosion processes.
Yeah,
my brain is just
your wind blowing sands, just water movements, and you've got yourself a natural silting deposit.
Baby, you've got a rubbish going.
Exciting.
That's an Arrested Development joke for people, kind of.
There's also me.
So we have these like 5 different ways to kind of tackle this really massive topic of zooarchaeology of food. As Simona said, we have animal products, hunting, food preparation, feasting, and rubbish. And we've kind of already covered animal products in our many domestication episodes. So many. We have a previous episode all about hunting for the people who are maybe just starting to listen to this podcast. Go ahead and listen to that. We have a whole episode on feasting as well. You know, ritual, our other favorite thing in this entire podcast. But just kind of as a brief summary. So when we talk about animal products, we're talking about, you know, milk from cattle, sheep and goats, wool from sheep, all that kind of stuff.
But milk from camels as well, and donkey.
Oh, sure, yeah. I mean, I was just going for like the big ones, the main.
But I guess it depends on where in the world both.
True, of course.
Cattle, sheep, goat.
Yeah.
But of course, stuff like milk and butter, 'cause I think we've discussed before, and I think feasting episode, we have discussed archaeological butter as well.
Oh, yeah. Hog butter. We love to see it.
Of course, unless it's a very specific sort of anaerobic deposit, you're very unlikely to get butter or milk, but you can get trace elements of that if you do residual analysis of pottery vessels. But then again, it's very 50-50 depending on how well they've preserved.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Another one that doesn't preserve, again, would be wool from sheep. Again, unless it's an anaerobic deposit with like an absolute lack of air, you're not necessarily going to get textiles. But of course, they are a thing now, and they would have been a thing back then, whichever insert time period here. Yeah, so that's your animal products.
Yeah, and then of course we have hunting, which again, a lot of these things I think overlap as well, because obviously with hunting you get products like meat and other forms of subsistence, but of course you differentiate because some of these animals are wild, which we also have an episode about. Oh my gosh. We are going to be running out of episode topics soon.
That's all right. We can have like whole episodes of just Tristan making puns.
Nope, never. We'll cancel the podcast.
Ready and waiting. I'm here. Somebody called me.
No. No.
Please. I still have yet to make a pun this episode, so just wait. I'll be cooking one up right now.
It'll just be like an hour of archaeology puns.
Yes.
Anyway, we've also covered feasting. So let's kind of focus on the other parts. No puns allowed. If there's any puns, I will throw my laptop out my window.
I will not abide to this heartless rule. I shall make puns if so inclined.
So kind of for this episode, I wanted to at least attempt to maybe not be so British centric with our examples and things like that. So kind of to start off, I did want to mention that there are other methods of collecting animals for food, scavenging off coastlines, things like that, which we do actually see here in Britain. But one that I actually saw while I was looking through the Archaeology of Food book, which is a massive book that is really interesting. The North American clam farms, which are managed and cultivated by the Northwest Coast First Peoples. That's cool, and also would be so interesting to find archaeologically that I'm super jealous of that. I want to see clam farms,
Yes, pardon my ignorance, is it literally a clam farm?
Yeah, they're like these very, from what I understand, they're like these set deposits of just clams that are grown and then can be, picked out and eaten.
It's interesting because the area where I'm from, we also farm clams.
Oh, really? Okay. I mean, I guess that makes sense.
Because we have, more particularly in the closest town to where I'm from, I think they cultivate, for lack of a better term, freshwater clams as well in an artificial lake that's there. So I think they've got this big cages that of course will be made out of metal now, and they're sort of raised in there and then sort of harvested and sold at fish markets.
That's actually super interesting. And also, I love clams. Wow, I really wish I ate food before we started talking about this.
It's also because it's something, just to make it British-centric one more time, it's something clams, you can't find them very easily here, I found. Yeah, the closest thing is cockles.
Yeah, it's weird, especially because coming from northeast United States, places like Boston are known for clams and stuff, like clam chowder and stuff like that. So it's weird to be here.
We have lots of scallops.
But that's not the
scallops
same.
Or scallops or however you say them.
I think cockles, to be fair, I'm not an expert on food, but to me they taste almost identical. Because I wanted to make some pasta with clams and couldn't find them anywhere, so I thought cockles, they kind of look alike. Let's give that a go. And I couldn't tell the difference, to be honest. I've looked them up, and the species are nothing alike. They're just not related at all, aside from being both, bivalve mollusks. But the taste is not really that different. I think, if anything, the main difference is while clams do tend to be sort of, again, cultivated, for lack of a better term, cockles do tend to be harvested in the wild.
I do like cockles. They used to, where I grew up, they would actually have cockles, in the fish and chip shops, beside the pickled eggs and the beetroot, you'd also have cockles that you could order alongside your fish and chips. So that's a really big memory for me. And there's fishmongers as well, about maybe 100 meters from where the boats came in, and like they always had cockles in their, like fresh cockles in their trays beside the fish. It was really nice.
In the fish and chip shops, they weren't pickled, were they?
Oh yeah, they were pickled. Yeah.
Oh,
or no, they were. Oh no, I think maybe they were in some sort of fluid. I don't know if they were pickled.
Well, because usually it's how you buy them fresh. They're sort of preserved, so they tend to be in like spring water or things that not necessarily vinegar. Although I guess you can pickle pretty much everything. It's just I personally despise vinegar. It's weird because I've got about 10 litres of vinegar in my house because I use it to make cleaning products, but I don't consume any of it.
Sorry, I'm just thinking about clam chowder still.
I think that's going to become a recurring theme in this episode.
Say it the way we all know clam chowder is meant to be said. Come on, please, Alex, do it.
Clam chowder?
Hey. Oh, there we go. I can rest in peace.
And here's me going, what is clam chowder?
So you have two different types of clam chowder. You have the Boston clam or New England clam chowder, which is the white one. And then you have Manhattan clam chowder, which is like this red tomatoey one that's awful. And you only want the white one, which is the good one. It's mostly a New England thing. I love it. It's got clams and it's got potatoes and I don't know what else, but it's clams. I've never made it from scratch. That seems like a lot of work.
Clams, potatoes, and stuff.
Yeah, I just buy it canned.
No, so is it like a soupy type thing?
Yeah, it's definitely more soupy. It depends on like who makes it. A lot of people put like bits of like croutons and stuff in it and crackers. So
soupy clams.
Anyway. We should probably get back to talking about zooarchaeological food. Although, I'm sure there's been some more historical sites in Massachusetts where you can find the remains of glorious New England clam chowder.
So how does this lead us on to archaeological food preparation?
I mean, it doesn't. But it will now. So basically, this is a very obvious thing I'm about to say, but yeah, even in the deep, deep past, food had to, be prepared before being eaten for the most part.
Unless you like your meat raw.
Yeah, which, no judgment. I love a nice pink steak, to be honest. Whom among us doesn't? One of the big questions is how do we determine when the animal remains we're looking at have been cooked? Because obviously, even if you're looking at the remains of food preparation, you're still only looking at bone. So I think the most obvious one is burning. So thankfully to amazing experimental archaeology nerds out there who are the real heroes, truly, because they know how to do stuff practically and I don't. They've shown us that burnt bone changes in color and in texture based on the temperature and intensity of fire. So colors can go from brown to more black and then into like a blue, gray, white when it's calcinated, which means that it's hit extremely high temperatures of over 1,000.
It's about that. I think like it's some number over sort of 1,000 degrees Celsius. So usually if you find sort of a calcined remains that are like very, very white or sort of slightly cracked, it tends to be associated more with cremated remains, which is not necessarily what you're going to find in a cooking setting. If you're having a barbecue, no one's going to have a fire that reaches that higher temperature.
Not with that attitude.
I mean, you could, but it'll just be pointless. And I think that might spoil the meat.
Not with that attitude.
I mean, be my guest. We'll do an Archaeoanimals experimental archaeology project. I'll have me a nice barbecue at a steady low temperature, and you can go set yours ablaze with 1,000 degrees. See how it goes.
Giant barbecue pyre. Heck yeah.
They'll see it 1,000 years down the line and think it was a ritual, like it says the sacrifice of the god of fire.
No, it was a ritual for being super awesome.
Yeah, so like a celebration of self by setting things on fire. Okay.
Well, it's not just cremations. I mean, cremations are probably the most common form of calcinated bone, but I literally just finished writing off part of a chapter about calcinated bone in my own work. And a lot of times you'll find it in hearths because they've been, pushed off of tables or things like that. They're just scraps. So you kind of just throw them in the hearth and then they become calcinated. And I guess technically cremated at that point.
Yeah, but I guess it wouldn't be sort of directly, a byproduct of food production per se. It'll be either sort of bits of bone that fell into the hearth, either from the cooking area or somewhere else, and then just more fires were had over and over again until that bone was burnt upon beyond recognition, sort of thing.
Yeah, true. But I just figured it's like another thing to kind of point out. You can't, so that if we find calcinated bone, we can't immediately just be like, that's cremation. It could be loads of other things.
Oh, no.
And I think that burning is a really weird, nebulous kind of thing because, again, depending on the intensity of the fire, the temperature of fire, if the fire is directly on the bone or if it's like indirectly, you get all these kind of differences in the like physical characteristics. So like the differences in heat exposure can be seen in different elements. So let's say a meat joint's being roasted, the epiphysis showing the bone will be more affected than the diaphysis, or like, the part that's basically covered with meat. So you'll see more of that like that scorching on that bone that's sticking out.
You might see, like one of the ends of the femurs being completely charred, but then sort of the epiphysis of the part in the middle and end, say the other epiphysis looking burnt, but not as burnt. Because of course, the one epiphysis where I guess the joint had been dislocated would have been exposed to the heat, to intense heat, while the meat around it would have shielded the bone underneath somewhat.
Yeah, and like I said, it also, not all bone is going to be, or not all meat, is going to be applied directly to the heat source. Because there's so many ways to cook. You can use dry heat, which means you're roasting or frying or grilling, or moist heat, which is boiling, steaming, stewing, and that's going to have different effects on the bone, or not necessarily show at all. And then you have charring, which is a combination of the two, which is barbecue, baby. Oh, I can go for barbecue now.
Well, how about we take a quick break and you can have a very, very mini barbecue.
Yay.
Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high-quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high-quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on, and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months, or go to zencastr.com and use the code ANIMALS. Looking to expand your knowledge of X-rays and imaging in the archaeology field? Then check out An Introduction to Paleoradiography, a short online course offering professional training for archaeologists and affiliated disciplines. Created by archaeologist, radiographer, and lecturer James Elliott, the content of this course is based upon his research and teaching experience in higher education. It is approved by the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists as 4 hours of training. That's in the UK, for those of you that don't know. So don't miss out on this exciting opportunity for professional and personal development. For more information on pricing and course structure, visit paleoimaging.com. That's PALEO imaging.com, and look for the link in the show notes to this episode.
And we are back with Archaeoanimals. Today we are talking about the zooarchaeology of food. I'm slowly but surely starving to death during this podcast, but it's fine. And I guess we're going to talk a bit more about food prep, because that's kind of a lot of what the zooarchaeology of food is, in a way.
It's almost the near entirety of it, because then when you think about it, most of the animal remains that we get are associated with food preparation. Of course, you do get your ritual, which we've discussed before. We get sort of full animal burials, but then really, I think the majority of it does tend to be food consumption related. Like comparatively, sort of ritual depositions are quite rare overall.
Yeah.
So I guess the other obvious one after signs of cooking will be signs of butchery, which of course, we've discussed before, as you've mentioned before, in the episode on feasting, and again on the episode on hunting, I believe. But it'll be good to have a little recap again. Of course, in butchery, like some of the signs you may find on bone are cut and chop marks. which is a pretty good indicator that some sort of modification for consumption has occurred, or not necessarily, could be for bone working purposes as well, but that's another kettle of fish. But more often than not, if you do get chop marks, it has been to portion off the meat. It could either be sort of a primary butchery kind of chop, sort of to remove the parts that you don't necessarily eat. It could be some further chop marks to sort of portion the carcass sort of in more biteable, bite-sized chunks, if you will pardon the pun once more.
Is that really a pun? Biteable, bite-sized?
Bite-sized chunks? Because it'll be small.
I'll give it a 6. I'll give it a 6 on the pun scale. Just like as an authority on puns, I think, yeah. No, bite size is like it's a decent pun.
You say that like it's something to be proud of.
Well, you know what? Like I have to grasp onto things that like are accolades. I have to just like sink my teeth into something and just never let go. I'm just like tearing into it like a big chunk of meat.
Pun master general.
Hey, you said it, not me.
Yes, you would have your chop marks sort of for portioning. Then you can also find some smaller cut marks for skinning and filleting. Because the difference between the two being in a way sort of self-explanatory. If you find a femur that's literally got a chop through the middle of it, that's a chop mark. Or sometimes you can find some little thin marks over the surface of the bone, especially sort of if they're V-shaped, as if made with a knife, that would have been more than likely a sign that joint of meat had been sort of skinned or filleted. Not to be confused with some sort of more like uneven sort of like zigzag. No, actually, no. What would saw marks look like? I'm being temporarily blank.
I don't know. I'm trying to think because that's not necessarily something that I see ever working in like the prehistory. So
this would be more sort of vertical sided with a bit of a blunt point.
Yeah, of course, depending on like, the kind of saw that you're using. Because obviously you have if you're working in more historical archaeology, you have the more modern saws where you have like that nice clean cut that you would find if you buy meat from, the grocery store and stuff like that. But if you're talking more about the older kind of saws that you'd have to actually like go back and forth with, yeah, I don't know.
Would be as cleaner a cut, yeah. But
I assume there'd be like parallel striations, kind of.
Yeah, because this will be interesting as well, sort of in sort of archaeological butchery as opposed to modern, or anywhere where traditional tools are used. Is that sometimes you might find multiple attempts at sawing or chopping off, particularly, and be like, oh, okay, no, this isn't working out. I'll try like an inch to the right, and then just keep going.
That's me in the archaeological record, is someone who's just like, well, okay, I can't do it, I'm gonna try it again.
Yeah, because an inch that way just makes all the difference, guys.
It's an archaeology of failures, which is my upcoming book that I've just decided to write.
Excellent. So you can have your food preparation, your cooking, whichever method you've chosen to implement. And then, of course, after you've had your fill of your dinner, you get back to our point 5, or it's called the archaeological sort of culinary rubbish. But how do you determine sort of what has been used for eating and what has been thrown away?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely like a really important part to like parse out, because basically everything we talked about that you would find in food prep, you could also find in the rubbish, except for fish bones. Those are always trash, regardless of what it's being used at. I don't care.
Stop dissing the fish. Do you want the fish people to come to your house, outside your house again, like months ago?
Yes, because I'm hungry.
Also, like they're good enough for you to eat, but not for you to talk about. Unbelievable.
It's that saying that I read in zooarchaeology papers all the time, where it's good enough to eat, good enough to think, or something. I butchered that. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. No, this podcast is ruining me.
Speaking of culinary rubbish, of course, you get 2 different types. Of course, you have the stuff that you've eaten, and there's your leftovers, say what's been left of your pork ribs, and you eat all the meat around it, and then you go ahead and chuck away the ribs. And there's also the stuff that you never intended to eat in the first place. Because the difference between the two is that normally, because the ones that you've eaten will show some kind of cooking to it, so like see part 1, while the ones that you were never intending to eat, more often than not, have not undergone any cooking, more often than not. So, of course, if you're having a hog roast, where you tend to sort of roast the entire pig, then, of course, you'd have signs of burning on the skull as well, but chances are you're not going to eat the head. So that still gets tossed, but it's not actually being consumed.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to bring up fish again, but I will, and I do hate to bring it up again. But the one kind of example I always think of is, you usually remove the head of a fish prior to cooking, although that's not always the case. There's places, specifically places in like the Iron Age British Isles, where if you have some of the smaller fish, you could just eat them whole. So,
To be fair, like, I know of people that do eat the heads, like they eat the eyes as well.
Yeah, you do you. I've probably eaten fish eyes before, but I guess that's also an interesting point of like what we determine might have been food, the stuff that wouldn't have been eaten, because I think there's also a lot of modern day bias of like, oh yeah, we normally wouldn't eat so-and-so, so they probably didn't eat it.
Absolutely, because something that in our particular society is seen as something that you wouldn't eat, in another society that might be a delicatesse.
Exactly, yeah.
It goes across geographical areas, it goes across backgrounds and time periods. So of course, like, there's one method that I think we discussed before, I think in the hunting episode, about how prime a cut is. So normally, especially like in hunter-gatherer societies, so in the Paleolithic, say, for instance, they would have chosen certain parts to carry back to the site over others because they bore more meat content. But then again, that in itself is not a strategy you can rely on 100%, because they might have also gone for a part that isn't a heavily meat-bearing joint, but that they would have considered particularly tasty.
Yeah, no, exactly.
And the archaeology of taste will be something incredibly subjective to go look into.
There's also kind of the broader context you have to think of as well. Like, as a kind of a personal example, I was working on an assemblage where we had, so many marrow cracking occurring that I was like, oh, it must be, I must have done something wrong. Like, this must be a misidentification, because I was finding it on like bird bones and things like that. And then I realized, depending on the situation, if people are starved for nutrients, they're looking for supplements to food resources that may be almost depleted because of famine or just, something like that. You're going to go for just every bit that you can eat, including the marrow from animals that you wouldn't necessarily be extracting marrow from. So there's definitely a lot of different biases at play. So I guess in a lot of ways, even though the archaeology or the zooarchaeology of food is a big portion of the field, it's also pretty tricky because of all these different things happening at once.
I think that's a running theme for archaeology per se, because I think one of the hardest jobs that we have to do is to remove that bias. Because all the quantification thing, that's all nice and good. That's something that you get with practice, but removing the bias is as crucial as it is difficult at times.
Yeah, I mean, there's been times where I've in my head have mentally separated assemblages by like, oh, this is like, definitely stuff that they hunted or whatever, and these are just like random bits that are natural deposits. And of course you're like, hang on, even though we would just say, oh, this site's on a beach, so there's going to be seagulls everywhere, we don't necessarily know if they weren't trying to catch any seagulls, because that's been evident in prehistory. So it's just a lot of stuff that you kind of have to like get your mind over and kind of end up thinking of every single possibility, and then your brain hurts, and that's how I feel all the time now. You okay?
Yes, we've had a moment of meditation on the statement.
Wait, do I need to get the incense out and like the Reiki music? Like, what's happening here?
Well, we're just thinking about how we're having a galaxy brain moment, I think, thinking about all the things you have to think about when you do zooarchaeology.
It was a zooarchaeology mindfulness. Like, think about this tibia.
Think about the shape of the astragalus.
We love to see
That
it.
is a very beautiful shape. There's something,
It
there'll be
is.
something great to meditate on.
Beep beep. Do 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 beep beep. That like it's like a car. Beep
Yeah,
beep.
it's a little car. And I really want to get a tattoo of one, but I think no one will ever recognize what it is and it'll just look weird.
And?
Yeah, that's fair. I guess that's completely fair. But it's like I always wanted to get like a bird tibia tarsus, but I also think like no one would understand what that is and it would look weird. So I only have like mandibles and femurs.
But you've got a botanical reference collection. May well expand more onto the zooarchaeology realm.
That is true.
I like that I find a plant naturally occurring in my garden. I don't know what it is, and you come to the rescue by looking at your tattoos.
To be fair, I was wrong though.
But it was close enough.
That's true. Yeah, it's kind of a shame that I got all these tattoos and then didn't think of maybe theming it to all zooarchaeology stuff. I'm not very good at planning things out, folks.
That's all right. I'm sure you got parts left that can get more tattoos. So
I do. I do not have monies left to get more tattoos. So truly the greatest struggle of my life. But yeah, actually, because we were just talking about tattoos and I have different mandibles tattooed on me, it just made me think of the other thing that about the zooarchaeology of food that I only just realized now is you can actually, also see consumed food after it has passed through the body.
yes, delightful.
Yes.
I think we have discussed it before. It's not something I've encountered personally, but it's been interesting reading about it. The pictures a bit less so.
No, I mean, to be fair, I've also had a slightly less messy version of that where smaller bones like fish vertebrae, when they get passed through a person or a animal, usually basically as it goes through the digestive tract, it gets compressed and like erosion happens on the outside of the bone. So if you come across, say, fish vertebrae that look like that, there's a good chance that it probably just went through the digestive system. So there you go.
Well, that's a new take on rummaging through dead people's rubbish.
There you go. Also, I was going to say gnaw marks as well, which we don't necessarily get human gnaw marks, I feel like, as much as you get non-human species, because non-human species usually are like gnawing at bone. That's also something that you can kind of look at, because there's also, you throw like a bit of meat to the dog or something like that, which is still, you can see in the archaeological record sometimes as well.
Yeah, no, you do see it. It's interesting to see whether it's something that has been cooked and eaten and then tossed to animals or scavengers, or whether it was parts that were given to the animal from the get-go as raw joints, and maybe something you weren't planning on consuming and just give it to the dog.
Yeah, I guess it depends. You'd have to look and see, is there a bit of burning on it? Is this a meat that was like over the fire? Again, it's complicated.
I guess if you're curious to see what gnaw marks, say, from a dog would look like on an animal bone, you can readily buy sort of like bones for dogs, give one to your dog, and then see what shapes it makes. So you've got yourself some experimental archaeology going. Although please not cooked bone. Do not give your dog cooked bone.
No. That said, if you let your dog go at some bone, or, if you have a cat, cats are known to also chew on bone occasionally, send us pictures because it's nice to have a reference.
Well, my cat can't chew on anything. She's got no teeth.
Aww.
Not that she would have had time to chew on things anyway. She's just too busy with her snoozes and dozes and naps, so...
That's a big mood, and I think we'll take a break, and then I will take a mini nap during this break in honor of your cat.
You may have heard my pitch for membership. It's a great idea and really helps out. However, you can also support us by picking up a fun t-shirt, sticker, or something from a large selection of items from our TeePublic store. Head over to arcpodnet.com/shop for a link. That's arcpodnet.com/shop to pick up some fun swag and support the show.
And we are back, and we are talking about the zooarchaeology of food today on Archaeoanimals. And we're up to everyone's favorite part of the show, the case studies, or case study. It's just one today, mostly because I forgot to write more.
Because Alex is really, really hungry, so...
I'm really hungry.
One case study for now.
Yeah, I think we can live. And to be honest, actually, it was kind of hard to find a project that was specifically about looking at cuisine. Because like we were saying, regardless of what archaeological site you work on, for the most part, you're probably going to end up running into remains from consumption because, newsflash, everyone eats and everyone's had to eat since the beginning of time.
I don't eat. I've never eaten once in my life.
Except for Simona. Simona goes outside, lets the sun hit her, and she's fine.
Well, it's because I've never had chili con carne, so I've never truly eaten.
Oh, I wish I had chili right now. Ugh, this is cruel. Anyway, there's definitely been some studies on looking at subsistence over time, exploitation of certain species, but that also kind of felt more like domestication, things like that. So I decided to stick with the US of A, and we're going to talk about Montpelier cuisine. Have a solid minute of all of us pronouncing Montpelier.
Montpelier.
Montpelier. Simona?
Montpelier cuisine.
Yay!
Okay, Simona gets the crown.
Montpelier cuisine. For people who are not from the US, and to be honest, probably a lot of people in the US, because who can learn all that history, honestly? Montpelier is the name of the property that James Madison, who was a president, one of the ones we all forget because, there's a lot of them. That's the property in which he lived in. And there's been years and years of archaeological excavation going on at the property. One of the cool things about it is that you can kind of, through the zooarchaeological assemblages there, you can actually see the way US cuisine changes over time. Specifically kind of like what were the luxury foods and what were like the specific foods that related to status, because obviously as James Madison, he's probably as high of status as you can get in the United States. Please do not ask me like what number president he was or when he was president, because I don't know that stuff.
No, I don't know either. But I'm glad you cleared it up with Montpelier being the name of the property, because I was just there being puzzled as to why sort of a study on the US had the name of the capital of Quebec.
I didn't even know it was the capital of Quebec. Huh. Well, yeah, there was this. So kind of, this is like the late 1700s, early 1800s. There was a really big, from what I understand, there was a big influence of French culture on, specifically the higher status people of the United States.
I said something incredibly stupid. It's not the capital of Quebec. It's a city in France. It's a city in France.
Same thing.
Inland in France.
You got France, and then you have northern France.
I'm not sure, just because in my head, because I thought it's a North American case study. Montpellier, Quebec. No, not Quebec. No, I'll take a penalty box later or something.
Yeah, no, I mean, I 100% believed you, so I'm not any much better.
It was a test, and you've passed. No, actually, no, you're not passed.
No, I didn't pass. Is this a test?
Only one way to find out.
See, we all thought that I'd be the one who cracked during this episode because of hunger. But it's you, apparently, who is trying to wrap their mind around the French connection here.
Because it's Montréal, no Montpellier, Montréal. My apologies to all residents of Quebec.
Yeah, what great shame you've brought upon them.
Right, first it was fish, now it's people in Quebec. Who else are we going to insult here?
We didn't. I mean, Simona insulted the great people of Quebec.
We still haven't got over the fish thing, okay? That's still a thing.
Fish people come at me.
And birds.
And birds. There's a lot, yeah.
You hate a lot of things.
I mean, I'm a New Yorker. We're born to hate.
Right, but back to the Montpelier cuisine, which is definitely not in Quebec.
No, it is in the US. Like I said, there was a big kind of French influence on the upper crust of America. I don't know this as hard research, but I assume it's probably due to the fact that, we had the great French help in the Revolutionary War, and there were so many connections between France and America at that time, specifically with the quote-unquote founding fathers like James Madison. So it makes sense, I guess.
Yes, I think, of course, given the particular background that has been looked into in this case study, as you've mentioned, most of what we got from the zooarchaeological analysis is really sort of some very sort of luxury and high status foods. So these would by no means sort of reflect to the entire population, but only sort of, well, the 1%.
Yeah, which is like kind of what a lot of archaeology ends up being, isn't it? Especially early archaeology, because all those rich people who were going to Egypt were looking at the average person's grave, were they? They were looking at the big old tombs.
Yes, there is a tend to have that. I don't think you have that so much here per se, because it's a very sort of development-led. There is research as well, but it's also a very development-led archaeological sector. You do tend to look at everything, regardless of status, geographical area. You just go in there and dig up some bones.
And I mean, we're also seeing this kind of thing in America too, given that we're talking about a ex-president's property, which has gotten a lot of excavation done. And I think a lot of the big projects in the United States, at least archaeologically, are those kind of estates. Like I know Thomas Jefferson's property, which I'm quickly looking up the name because I'm pretty sure it's another French one. Monticello, that's what it is. That also has a pretty big excavation going on.
Yeah, there's something I personally don't know an awful lot on, which I guess is all the more interesting that we're covering right now.
Yeah, no, definitely. So you basically, like Simona was saying, you have mostly these kind of elite foods that showcase status and wealth. And some of these foods were more exotic kind of meats from animals that were difficult to obtain. This specific project that we're talking about was specifically looking at these kind of elite foods. Apparently at Montpelier, there's these kind of two main periods of time. So you have the honeymoon years, which is 1797 to 1801, and then the retirement years, which is 1818 to 1836. And those are the years after he was president. I don't know like how it works in other countries, but like, I mean, I assume it's the same because of, capitalism and stuff. Presidents kind of just live good for the rest of their lives, even after their term is up. The honeymoon years had a really diverse zooarchaeological record. It included both domestic and wild animals. So the kind of like wild game was most likely the big luxury food. But domestic livestock was mostly consumed. Apparently pig and pork was really big in Montpelier. So you have calcine bone, like we were talking about before. These are the bone that's exposed to really high heat. In this place, they're actually been interpreted as scraps that fell off and into the hearth. So those are the kind of like trends that were mainly in the honeymoon years. And then in the retirement years, you actually see more consumption of pig, specifically young pig, and also veal. So, juvenile cattle remains.
I must interrupt a young pig with my usual reference. How very Roman of them.
Go. You know what? Go ahead if you want to talk a little bit more about young pig. In Roman times.
It's just that a suckling pig, so a very, very juvenile pig, was a delicacy in the Roman period.
There you go.
There you go. How Roman of them.
Yeah, I was going to say, we hadn't had a Simona's Roman moment yet. So.
I know, right?
Yeah, we almost went through a whole episode not talking about the Romans, I think.
But then we're going to lose out on those cups of coffee. But one question I did have, though, about because you're saying in the honeymoon years, you tend to have sort of like the more luxury foods being wild game. Now, how luxury was it? As in, was it just wild game that is native to the US, or were they bringing in, say, giraffe meat?
It wasn't that wild from what I remember. It was basically kind of the wild game that I think was mostly native to the States, but it wasn't necessarily something your average Joe was eating, you know?
Yeah, just because you think if you have like a huge disposable income, so like you having this sort of very elite food, like it wouldn't be outside the realms of possibility to just get different meats from all over the world brought in because you can.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that's a thing now. Yeah, I don't think there was necessarily anything that out there. Like I was saying before too, there was such a big influence of French culture that seeped into culinary as well. So a lot of the foods they ate were kind of based on the same foods that were being eaten in France at the time. And then the really interesting thing, I think, is the differences in butchery. So specifically in the retirement years, find way more butchery marks. So the interpretation is actually that they were probably breaking down meat a bit more to make specifically for stews and soups and things like that, which is something I literally have never thought about in interpretation. So that says a lot about me.
No, it's interesting in a way as well, because again, we are talking about like the zooarchaeological record of the upper class. Mm-hmm. So if you have an elite diet, stews and soup is not something you'd associate with that, because normally you'd make a stew and soups to get literally the most out of your meat, or say meat that's sort of past its time a little bit, so you just boil it for longer so it's still okay to eat. So in a way, it's interesting to see it in this particular context.
Yeah, I guess at that point, you're kind of thinking less about, how are they getting the most out of, the most bang for their buck. And because these are like elite people who have access to all these kind of resources, it seems like it's more of a stylistic thing. Like that was a bit more in vogue in terms of like what foods you were eating, which is like really interesting to kind of think about as well, how that has influence on the material culture you end up with, how things.
Because I don't know sort of when James Madison died, but could there have been, say, a parallel sort of between eating more stewy and soupy foods with old age, where perhaps you can't chew things as well?
I actually don't know when he died, but I'm going to look it up real quick. 1836. So yeah, the retirement years ends with him dying. Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense thinking about it in that context.
I actually have a question. So I'm just thinking, from the stews, could you figure out how many boars were used in like a stew? You can do the minimum number of individuals on like a site. I mean, would you say like one of these stews had 3 to 5 like feral hogs or something like that?
Not sure you could quite do that with a stew, because you don't necessarily tend to stew meat with the bone on, or at least not the stews I've had personally. So I guess you could do an M&I, like a minimum number of individuals, if you get the bones out of it, but say in the odd eventuality where you've made a stew that's solely of wild boar femurs, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, would these feral hogs be running around in the yard, or would they be hunting them?
That's
Do you get the joke?
I think I do.
Okay.
I'm really trying here. Come on.
Well, to be fair, I was going to say Simona's not on Twitter anymore, really. So.
No, I was expecting a response to you, Alex. Actually, I didn't get the groan or the disappointment that I was wanting.
You don't deserve it. But yeah, that's about it for the archaeology of food, or zooarchaeology of food. I keep saying archaeology of food, and that's the name of a book. But yeah, no, as always, subscribe to our podcast, get your friends to subscribe, rate and review us. Nice things, please. We're on Twitter at archaeoanimals. I don't know what else to say. I'm slowly but surely fading away from lack of food.
Best get some food in you then.
Yeah. See you guys.
Go have that pasta.
Thank
for listening to ArchaeoAnimals. Please subscribe and rate the podcast wherever you get your podcast from. You can find us on Twitter at ArchaeoAnimals. Also, the views expressed on the podcast are those of ourselves, the hosts and guests, and do not necessarily represent those of our institution, employers, and the Archaeology Podcast Network. Thanks for listening.
This show is produced and recorded by the Archaeology Podcast Network, Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, in Reno, Nevada, at the Reno Collective.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.